The morning sun barely touched the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle when James Patterson began his routine patrol through the royal quarters. He had served as a royal guard for 15 years, and every corridor, every painting, every creaking floorboard was as familiar to him as his own reflection. The castle was quiet at this early hour, with most of the staff still preparing for the day ahead and the royal family yet to emerge from their private chambers. James walked with measured steps, his polished boots clicking softly against the marble floors. His uniform was immaculate as always, the golden buttons gleaming under the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers that lined the hallways. He took pride in his work, in being part of something greater than himself. Protecting the monarchy wasn't just a job to him. It was an honor passed down through generations of his family. As he turned into the West Wing, something caught his attention. The door to one of the storage rooms was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Security protocols demanded that all doors remain locked when not in use, especially in areas that housed royal belongings. James felt a flutter of concern in his chest. His hand instinctively moved to his radio, but he paused. Perhaps a cleaning staff member had simply forgotten to close it properly. No need to raise an alarm just yet. He approached the door carefully, pushing it open with caution. The room was dimly lit, with only the natural light filtering through a small window high on the wall. Dust particles danced in the pale beam of sunlight. The space was filled with wardrobes, garment bags, and storage boxes, all neatly arranged and labeled. This was one of several rooms where the royal family kept their extensive collection of formal wear, ceremonial outfits, and historical garments. James stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. Everything appeared to be in order. He was about to leave when he noticed something peculiar. One of the large oak wardrobes at the far end of the room had its door open, and inside he could see garments that seemed out of place. The fabrics looked extraordinarily rich, even by royal standards, with hints of gold and deep crimson visible in the shadowy interior. Curiosity got the better of him. James walked closer, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered this section of the floor. As he reached the wardrobe, he pulled the door open wider to get a better look. What he saw took his breath away. Hanging among several other formal dresses was a gown unlike anything he had ever seen before. The fabric was heavy silk in the deepest shade of crimson, embroidered with gold thread in intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. Jewels were sewn into the bodice, catching what little light there was and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. James knew enough about royal protocol to understand that this was no ordinary dress. The craftsmanship, the materials, the sheer weight of the garment all spoke of something significant. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could this be one of the Queen's old ceremonial gowns? But why would it be here, in what was essentially a storage area used by other members of the royal family? He reached out hesitantly, his fingers barely touching the fabric. It felt cool and impossibly smooth, like water made solid. There was a small tag attached to the hanger, and James leaned in to read it. His eyes widened as he made out the words, though they were faded with age. The tag indicated that this garment had been worn at a coronation ceremony decades ago. But it wasn't just any coronation garment. According to the label, this was the actual gown worn by Queen Elizabeth II during her coronation in 1953. James felt his heart begin to pound. This was a piece of history, a national treasure. Such items were supposed to be kept in the royal collection, carefully preserved and protected. They weren't meant to be hanging in a wardrobe in a storage room. He looked around the wardrobe more carefully now, and his confusion only deepened. The other garments hanging nearby were modern, elegant dresses that clearly belonged to Queen Camilla. He recognized some of them from recent public appearances and state dinners. The implications slowly began to dawn on him. Somehow, Queen Elizabeth's coronation gown had ended up in Queen Camilla's personal wardrobe. But how, and more importantly, why? James knew he had stumbled upon something that required immediate attention, but he also understood the delicate nature of royal affairs. He couldn't simply march to his supervisor and report what he had found without considering the potential consequences. He carefully closed the wardrobe door and stepped back, his mind working through the situation. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps the gown had been moved here temporarily for restoration work. Maybe it was being studied by historians or fashion experts, but if that were the case, surely it would be in a more secure location, not tucked away in a storage room with everyday garments. James pulled out his small notepad, something he always carried during his patrols. He quickly jotted down the details, the location, the time, what he had found, and the condition of the garment. He also noted the other dresses in the wardrobe, trying to establish a timeline of when this might have happened. The storage room didn't have security cameras, which was unusual but not unheard of for areas that weren't considered high risk. As he wrote, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had uncovered something significant. The coronation gown was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of continuity, of the unbroken line of monarchy that stretched back through centuries. For it to be here, mingled with contemporary garments, seemed almost sacrilegious. He finished his notes and tucked the notepad back into his pocket. The question now was what to do with this information. The chain of command was clear in his role as a royal guard, but this situation felt different. It wasn't a security threat in the traditional sense, but it was certainly irregular. James had always prided himself on his discretion and loyalty, two qualities that were essential in his line of work. But discretion had to be balanced with duty, and his duty was to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also their dignity and the integrity of the institution they represented. He took one last look around the storage room, committing every detail to memory. Then he stepped out, pulling the door closed behind him and ensuring it was properly locked this time. His patrol route would take him past the office of Mrs. Helena Whitmore, the senior household manager, in about 20 minutes. She would be the appropriate person to consult first, he decided. Mrs. Whitmore had been with the royal household for over 30 years and had seen everything. If anyone would know how to handle this situation with the appropriate level of sensitivity and discretion, it would be her. As James continued his patrol, his thoughts kept returning to that crimson gown hanging in the shadows. He wondered about its journey, how it had moved from the carefully controlled environment of the royal collection to a storage wardrobe. He thought about the hands that had created it, the seamstresses who had labored over every stitch, and the young queen who had worn it on the most important day of her reign. And now somehow it had reappeared in circumstances that raised more questions than answers. Mrs. Helena Whitmore sat behind her mahogany desk, reviewing the day's schedule with her reading glasses perched on her nose. She had just taken her first sip of Earl Grey tea when James knocked on her open door. She looked up and immediately noticed the tension in his posture, the way his jaw was set just a bit tighter than usual. In all the years she had known James Patterson, he had never been one to show unnecessary concern. If something was bothering him, it was worth paying attention to. She gestured for him to enter and close the door behind him. James did so, then stood at attention in front of her desk. Mrs. Whitmore set down her teacup and gave him her full attention. The morning light streaming through her office windows illuminated the worry lines on his face. Without preamble, James began to explain what he had discovered during his patrol. He spoke in measured tones, sticking to facts and avoiding speculation. As he described the coronation gown and its unexpected location, Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted from mild curiosity to serious concern. When James finished speaking, silence filled the room. Mrs. Whitmore removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture James had seen her make countless times when faced with a particularly thorny problem. She stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens below. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the geometric precision of the hedges and flower beds. Everything in its proper place, she thought. Everything except, apparently, a piece of national heritage. She turned back to James, her mind already working through the various scenarios and their potential implications. The coronation gown wasn't just any artifact. It represented a moment in history that millions had witnessed, a symbol of tradition and continuity. Its whereabouts should have been strictly documented and controlled. The fact that it had somehow migrated to a storage room used by Queen Camilla's wardrobe staff was deeply troubling. Mrs. Whitmore asked James several questions, probing for details he might have overlooked. Had the room shown any signs of forced entry? No. Had he noticed anyone in that area during previous patrols? No. Was the gown in good condition? Yes, remarkably so. She made her own notes, her elegant handwriting filling the page with observations and questions that would need answering. After several minutes of discussion, Mrs. Whitmore made a decision. This matter needed to be investigated quietly and quickly before it could become a larger problem. She instructed James to continue his regular duties and to speak to no one about what he had found. She would personally look into the matter and involve the appropriate people. James nodded, relieved to have passed the responsibility to someone with the authority and experience to handle it properly. He left her office feeling lighter, though the image of that crimson gown still burned in his memory. Once alone, Mrs. Whitmore picked up her phone and made a call to the Royal Collection Trust. She spoke with Dr. Margaret Chen, the curator in charge of royal ceremonial garments. The conversation was brief but enlightening. Dr. Chen confirmed that the coronation gown should indeed be in their secure facility, where it had been undergoing routine preservation work. The gown had been scheduled to be returned to display after the conservation process was completed. There was no reason for it to be anywhere else, certainly not in a wardrobe in Windsor Castle. The revelation sent a chill through Mrs. Whitmore. This wasn't a case of poor record-keeping or an administrative mix-up. Something more deliberate had occurred. She thanked Dr. Chen and asked her to verify the location of the gown in their inventory without alarming anyone. Dr. Chen agreed and promised to call back within the hour. Mrs. Whitmore spent the next 40 minutes going through wardrobe records, transfer logs, and staff schedules. She was looking for any indication of when and how the gown might have been moved. The paperwork was meticulous, as was expected in the royal household, but nothing jumped out at her. There were no authorized transfers of the gown to Windsor Castle, no request for it from Queen Camilla's staff, nothing that would explain its presence in that storage room. When her phone rang, she snatched it up immediately. Dr. Chen's voice was strained with worry. She had checked the conservation facility personally. The coronation gown was not there. In its place was a garment bag containing what appeared to be a replica, or perhaps another formal gown entirely. The switch had been so carefully done that no one had noticed. The security log showed no unauthorized access, which meant whoever had made the exchange had legitimate credentials and knew exactly what they were doing. Mrs. Whitmore felt her stomach drop. This was no longer just an irregularity. It was a serious breach of trust. The coronation gown was irreplaceable, both in terms of its historical significance and its monetary value. More than that, its disappearance and mysterious reappearance raised questions about security protocols and the integrity of staff members who had access to such precious items. She made another call, this time to Sir Edmund Blackwood, the master of the household. He was the most senior official in charge of the royal residences and their staff. This matter had escalated beyond her ability to handle alone. Sir Edmund listened to her report with growing alarm. He instructed her to secure the storage room immediately and to ensure that the gown was not moved or touched by anyone. He would convene a small, discreet meeting of senior staff to determine the next steps. Within 2 hours, a select group had gathered in a private conference room deep within the castle. Present were Sir Edmund, Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Chen, who had rushed over from London, the head of royal security, and the senior wardrobe mistress responsible for Queen Camilla's clothing. The atmosphere was tense. Each person present understood the gravity of the situation and the potential consequences if it became public knowledge. The wardrobe mistress, a woman named Sarah Williams who had served the royal family for over 20 years, looked particularly distressed. She insisted that she had no knowledge of how the coronation gown had ended up in the storage room. Her records showed no receipt of such an item, and she personally oversaw every garment that came into Queen Camilla's collection. She was clearly upset at the implication that something so serious could have happened under her watch without her knowledge. The head of security presented his preliminary findings. The storage room lock showed no signs of tampering, and the keys were accounted for. Only a handful of people had access to that particular room, and all of them had passed background checks and had spotless records. However, the security footage for that area had mysteriously malfunctioned 3 weeks ago. The malfunction had been reported and supposedly fixed, but now it seemed suspicious in light of recent events. Dr. Chen spoke about the importance of the gown and the proper protocols for its handling. She explained that the garment had been in conservation for 6 months, undergoing careful cleaning and preservation. Only 3 people on her team had direct access to it. She vouched for all of them personally, but agreed that they would need to be interviewed discreetly. The switch must have occurred during the conservation period when the gown was being worked on, and was more accessible than it would normally be. Sir Edmund listened to all of this with increasing concern. He was a man who had devoted his life to serving the monarchy and maintaining its dignity and prestige. The idea that someone within their trusted circle could have orchestrated such a theft and replacement was almost incomprehensible to him. Yet the evidence was clear. Someone had stolen the coronation gown from the conservation facility, replaced it with another garment to avoid immediate detection, and then hidden the real gown in a place where it might never have been found if not for James's sharp eyes during a routine patrol. The question that haunted everyone in that room was simple, but profound. Why would someone steal the coronation gown only to hide it in Queen Camilla's wardrobe? It made no sense. If the thief wanted to sell it, they would have taken it out of the castle entirely. If they wanted to damage the monarchy or cause embarrassment, there were far more effective ways to do so. The location of the gown suggested something else entirely, something more calculated and potentially more dangerous. It suggested that someone was trying to implicate Queen Camilla herself in the theft, or at least create a scandal that would reflect badly on her. The investigation began in earnest that same afternoon, though to outside observers the castle continued its normal operations without a hint of the turmoil brewing behind closed doors. Sir Edmund had made the decision to keep the matter contained to as few people as possible. The fewer who knew, the less chance of the story leaking to the press. A scandal involving the coronation gown and Queen Camilla would be devastating. Regardless of the truth behind it, Detective Inspector Caroline Hughes from Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit was called in discreetly. She was known for her work on high-profile cases involving stolen historical artifacts and had the necessary security clearance to work within royal properties. Caroline arrived at Windsor Castle in an unmarked car, dressed in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. She was shown to the same conference room where the senior staff had met earlier, and Sir Edmund briefed her personally on the situation. Caroline listened intently, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Her expression remained neutral throughout the briefing, though internally she was already forming theories. She had dealt with art theft for 15 years and knew that the psychology behind such crimes was often complex. This particular case had unusual elements that intrigued her. The theft itself had been executed with skill and insider knowledge, but the placement of the stolen item was amateurish, almost guaranteed to be discovered eventually. It didn't fit the profile of a professional art thief. Her first request was to interview James Patterson. She wanted to hear his account firsthand, to understand exactly what he had seen and how he had found the gown. James was brought to a private study, where Caroline put him at ease with her calm demeanor and straightforward questions. He walked her through his entire morning patrol, the open door, his decision to investigate, and his discovery of the coronation gown. Caroline paid particular attention to his description of the other garments in the wardrobe, and any small details he could remember about the room's condition. James mentioned something he hadn't included in his initial report to Mrs. Whitmore. As he had been closing the wardrobe, he had noticed a faint scent, something floral and expensive. It was so subtle that he had almost forgotten about it, but now that he was focusing on every detail, the memory returned. Caroline made a note of this. Perfume could be a useful identifier, especially in an environment where different staff members might wear different scents. After thanking James and instructing him once again to maintain absolute discretion, Caroline moved on to interview the conservation team from the Royal Collection Trust. She met with each of the 3 specialists individually. All of them seemed genuinely shocked by the news of the theft. They described their work on the coronation gown in detail, the careful cleaning process, the examination of the fabric for any signs of deterioration, the documentation of every aspect of the garment's condition. The gown had been kept in a secured conservation room with limited access, and they swore that it had been there the last time any of them had seen it, which was approximately 4 weeks ago. Caroline asked about the garment that had been left in place of the coronation gown. The conservators had examined it and determined that it was a high-quality reproduction, likely created specifically for display purposes. It was good enough to pass a casual inspection, but would never fool an expert upon close examination. The fabric was wrong, the embroidery less intricate, the jewels synthetic rather than genuine. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this replacement, which suggested premeditation and resources. The investigation then turned to the wardrobe staff who worked directly with Queen Camilla's clothing. Sarah Williams, the senior wardrobe mistress, provided Caroline with detailed records of every garment that had been received, catalogued, and stored over the past 6 months. She also provided a list of staff members who had access to the storage room where the gown had been found. The list was short. Sarah herself, 2 assistant wardrobe mistresses, and 3 cleaning staff who had been with the royal household for years. Caroline interviewed each person on the list. The assistant wardrobe mistresses, Emma Thompson and Claire Davidson, both seemed credible and cooperative. They were young women who had worked their way up through the household staff and were clearly devoted to their positions. Neither had any reason to risk their careers on such a dangerous scheme. The cleaning staff were equally convincing in their innocence, though Caroline made note of their backgrounds and personal circumstances. Financial problems or family issues could sometimes motivate good people to do desperate things. As the afternoon wore on, Caroline found herself without any obvious suspects. Everyone she interviewed seemed genuine in their shock and concern. Their alibis checked out for the time periods in question, though establishing exact timelines was difficult given the nature of the theft. The coronation gown could have been moved at any point during the 3-week period when the security cameras had been malfunctioning in that area of the castle. That was a wide window of opportunity. Caroline returned to the storage room itself, this time with a forensics team she had brought from London. They worked quietly and efficiently, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fiber samples, and photographing every inch of the space. The wardrobe that had contained the coronation gown received special attention. Multiple fingerprints were found, which was expected given the number of people who legitimately accessed the room. The forensics team would need to eliminate prints belonging to authorized staff to see if any unidentified ones remained. While the forensics team worked, Caroline examined the coronation gown itself. It had been carefully removed from the wardrobe and laid out on a clean table in an adjacent room. Seeing it up close, Caroline could understand why it was considered a national treasure. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every detail perfect. She photographed it from multiple angles and made careful notes about its condition. The gown showed no signs of damage or rough handling, which was something of a relief. Whoever had taken it had at least treated it with respect. Caroline noticed something interesting as she examined the gown's hanger. There were faint marks on the wooden surface, small indentations that might have been made by tools of some kind. She pointed these out to the forensics team, who collected samples and measurements. It was a small detail, but in cases like this, small details often proved crucial. By early evening, Caroline had gathered enough information to form a preliminary theory. The theft had required insider knowledge of both the Royal Collection Trust's conservation facility and Windsor Castle's layout and security protocols. The person responsible had access to both locations, or was working with someone who did. They had created a replica of the coronation gown in advance, suggesting planning over weeks or even months. They had waited for an opportunity when security cameras were down to move the gown to its hiding place. And they had chosen a location that would, when discovered, cast suspicion on Queen Camilla. This last point was what troubled Caroline the most. It suggested that the theft wasn't primarily about stealing a valuable artifact. It was about creating a scandal, damaging reputations, and potentially destabilizing the royal household during a sensitive time. Queen Camilla had faced challenges in winning public acceptance since her marriage to King Charles. A story involving her and stolen royal regalia could be devastating to her reputation, even if she was completely innocent. Caroline shared her thoughts with Sir Edmund and Mrs. Whitmore in a late-evening meeting. Both looked exhausted from the stress of the day, but they listened attentively to her assessment. Sir Edmund asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Who would benefit from such a scandal? Who had both the access and the motive to orchestrate something so elaborate and potentially destructive? Caroline admitted she didn't have a definitive answer yet, but she had some avenues to explore. She wanted to look into anyone who had recently left the royal household staff under difficult circumstances. Disgruntled former employees were always suspects in insider crimes. She also wanted to examine the financial records of current staff members with access, looking for any signs of unusual expenses or payments that might suggest they had been bribed or were in financial distress. And she wanted to trace the origin of the replica gown, which had to have been commissioned from somewhere. As the meeting concluded, Caroline felt a sense of determination settle over her. This case was complex and sensitive, but it was also solvable. Somewhere in the details she had gathered, in the interviews she had conducted, in the evidence collected by the forensics team, there were clues that would lead to the truth. She just needed to find the right thread to pull and watch the entire scheme unravel. The coronation gown had survived for over 70 years as a symbol of continuity and tradition. Caroline was determined to ensure that its story didn't end in scandal and disgrace. The breakthrough came 3 days later, though it arrived from an unexpected direction. Caroline had been working around the clock, following every lead and reviewing hours of security footage from various areas of the castle and the Royal Collection Trust facility. She had interviewed over 20 people and was beginning to feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her shoulders. The pressure to solve the case quickly was immense, even if most of the world remained blissfully unaware that anything was wrong. It was Mrs. Whitmore who provided the crucial piece of information, though she didn't realize its significance at first. She had been going through old staff requisition forms, looking for anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the theft. She came across a request from 5 months earlier for fabric samples and photographs of historical royal garments. The request had been made by someone in Queen Camilla's wardrobe department, ostensibly for a charity exhibition about royal fashion through the ages. The request had been approved without much scrutiny, as such requests were fairly common for educational and charitable purposes. What caught Caroline's attention was the specific mention of coronation garments in the request. Whoever had made the request had asked for detailed photographs and fabric samples from multiple coronation ceremonies, including Queen Elizabeth II's 1953 coronation. The person who had signed the requisition form was Claire Davidson, one of the assistant wardrobe mistresses Caroline had interviewed earlier. Caroline remembered Claire clearly. She was a bright, ambitious young woman in her late 20s who had joined the royal household 4 years ago. During her interview, Claire had been nervous but cooperative, answering all questions thoroughly. She had expressed appropriate shock at the news of the theft, and had seemed genuinely concerned about its implications. Nothing about her had raised red flags at the time. However, this requisition form put Claire in a new light. She had requested information that would be essential for creating a replica of the coronation gown. Caroline pulled Claire's employment file and began digging deeper into her background. On the surface, everything looked fine. Claire had excellent references, a clean criminal record, and had performed her duties admirably. But Caroline had learned long ago that people often hid secrets beneath respectable facades. A conversation with the Human Resources Department revealed something interesting. Claire had taken several days of personal leave over the past 6 months, more than usual, but not so much as to raise concerns. The dates of her leave were scattered throughout the period, never more than 2 days at a time. Caroline obtained copies of Claire's leave requests and began comparing them to other timelines she had established, when the conservation work on the gown had been happening, when the security cameras had malfunctioned, when various staff members had been on or off duty. A pattern began to emerge. Each time Claire had taken leave, it had coincided with a period when either the Royal Collection Trust facility or Windsor Castle had been operating with reduced security coverage. This could have been coincidence, but Caroline's instincts told her otherwise. She requested Claire's phone records and financial statements, working through the proper legal channels to obtain them. The process took another day, but what she found confirmed her suspicions. Claire's bank account showed several large cash deposits over the past 6 months, totaling nearly £20,000. The amounts were just small enough to avoid automatic reporting requirements, but together, they represented a significant sum of money for someone on her salary. There was no obvious legitimate source for these funds. Claire had also made several large cash withdrawals around the times when she had taken personal leave. Caroline also discovered something else in Claire's phone records. She had been in regular contact with a number registered to a woman named Diane Morrison. When Caroline ran that name through the system, she found that Diane had worked at the Royal Collection Trust as an administrative assistant until 8 months ago, when she had resigned suddenly. The official reason given was personal circumstances, but when Caroline spoke with Diane's former supervisor, a different picture emerged. Diane had been asked to resign after it was discovered that she had been accessing conservation records without authorization. She had been looking at files related to high-value items in the collection, including the coronation gown. The supervisor had wanted to report the matter to the police, but senior management had decided to handle it quietly to avoid publicity. Diane had been allowed to resign with a neutral reference in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. This was the connection Caroline had been looking for. Claire and Diane had been working together, using their respective positions to plan and execute the theft. But the question remained. Why had they hidden the gown in Queen Camilla's wardrobe instead of selling it or keeping it hidden elsewhere? Caroline needed to understand their motive to build a solid case. She decided it was time to interview Claire again, this time with the evidence she had gathered. Sir Edmund agreed, but insisted that the interview be conducted discreetly at Windsor Castle, rather than at a police station, to maintain confidentiality for as long as possible. Caroline understood his concern but insisted on having a uniformed officer present. If Claire was indeed guilty, she needed to be properly cautioned and arrested if necessary. The interview was scheduled for the following morning. Claire arrived at the small study where Caroline was waiting, looking puzzled but not particularly worried. Her expression changed when she saw the uniformed officer standing by the door. Caroline invited her to sit down and began by explaining that new evidence had come to light in the investigation. She wanted to give Claire an opportunity to explain some discrepancies in her previous statements. Claire's face grew pale as Caroline laid out the evidence. The requisition form for information about the coronation gown, the unusual pattern of leave days, the unexplained cash deposits, the phone calls to Diane Morrison. With each piece of evidence, Claire seemed to shrink in her chair. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together in her lap. For several long minutes she said nothing, and Caroline could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Finally, Claire began to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper at first, but it grew stronger as the words poured out. Yes, she had been involved in taking the coronation gown. Yes, she had worked with Diane to plan it. But she insisted it wasn't what Caroline thought. They hadn't stolen it for money or to sell it on the black market. They had been paid to take it and hide it in that specific location by someone else. Someone who had approached Diane shortly after she left the Royal Collection Trust. Caroline leaned forward, her attention completely focused. This was the critical moment. She asked Claire who had hired them, speaking slowly and clearly. Claire hesitated, fear evident in her eyes. She explained that she had never met the person directly. All communication had gone through Diane, who had been contacted by encrypted email and phone calls from burner numbers. The person had known intimate details about both women's employment situations and had offered them more money than they could refuse. £20,000 each paid in cash installments to avoid detection. The instructions had been specific. They were to take the coronation gown from the conservation facility when security was lightest, replace it with a replica that would be provided to them, and then hide the original gown in the storage room used for Queen Camilla's wardrobe. They were told that the gown would only be there temporarily, that someone else would retrieve it within a few weeks. But weeks had passed and no one had come for it. Claire had been growing increasingly nervous, fearing that they would be caught before the gown could be removed. Caroline asked the crucial question, did Claire or Diane have any idea why someone would want to frame Queen Camilla? Claire shook her head miserably. They had asked, but their anonymous employer had told them it was better if they didn't know. The money had been too good, and both of them had financial pressures. Claire's mother was ill and needed expensive care that wasn't fully covered by insurance. Diane had gambling debts that were spiraling out of control. They had convinced themselves that they were just moving the gown temporarily, that no real harm would come from it. Caroline felt a mixture of satisfaction at solving part of the puzzle and frustration that the mastermind behind the scheme remained unknown. Claire and Diane were tools, not the real criminals. Someone else had orchestrated this entire plot. Someone who understood the royal household well enough to know exactly where to apply pressure and how to make their plan work. Someone who wanted to damage Queen Camilla's reputation badly enough to go through this elaborate scheme. But who, and more importantly, why? Caroline worked with Diane Morrison's cooperation next. After Claire's arrest, it took less than 12 hours for Diane to be located and brought in for questioning. Faced with the evidence and knowing that Claire had already confessed, Diane quickly agreed to provide whatever information she had. Like Claire, she had never met their employer face to face. All communications had been through digital channels designed to maintain anonymity. However, Diane had kept copies of some of the encrypted emails, hoping they might serve as insurance if things went wrong. The forensics team specializing in digital crimes took over, working to trace the origins of the emails and phone calls. It was painstaking work, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of encryption and proxy servers. Meanwhile, Caroline focused on the human element. Someone had known enough about Claire and Diane to identify them as potential accomplices. Someone had understood the security systems and procedures of both Windsor Castle and the Royal Collection. Trust. Someone had a strong motive to damage Queen Camilla's reputation. Caroline created a profile of the person she was looking for. They were likely someone who had worked within the royal household or had close connections to it. They understood the protocols and hierarchies. They had resources enough to pay £40,000 in cash and to commission a high-quality replica of the coronation gown. Most importantly, they harbored deep resentment toward Queen Camilla, resentment strong enough to risk serious criminal charges. She began reviewing files of former royal household employees, particularly those who had left under negative circumstances in recent years. The list was longer than she expected. Working in royal service was prestigious but demanding, and not everyone adapted well to the strict protocols and constant scrutiny. Some had been dismissed for various infractions. Others had resigned due to personality conflicts or because they felt overlooked for promotions. A few had left after making complaints that were deemed unfounded or exaggerated. One name appeared repeatedly in various incident reports and complaints, though never in connection with anything serious enough to warrant dismissal. Victoria Ashford had worked as a senior dresser for Queen Elizabeth II for nearly 20 years, a position of considerable trust and prestige. She had been known for her meticulous attention to detail and her deep knowledge of royal ceremonial dress. When Queen Elizabeth passed away and Queen Camilla took on a more prominent role, Victoria had expected to continue in a similar position, perhaps even be promoted to a more senior role. Instead, she had been reassigned to a less prestigious position working with the General Royal Wardrobe rather than as a personal dresser to the Queen. The official explanation was a restructuring of staff responsibilities, but Victoria had taken it as a personal slight. She had made several formal complaints, suggesting that she was being pushed aside to make room for people who were loyal to Queen Camilla, rather than to the institution itself. Her complaints had been investigated and found to be without merit, which only increased her bitterness. Victoria had resigned 9 months ago, citing health reasons. Her departure had been cordial on the surface, with appropriate farewell ceremonies and expressions of gratitude for her years of service. But those who knew her well reported that she felt betrayed and angry. She believed that her loyalty to Queen Elizabeth's memory was being repaid with disrespect and disregard. She had made comments suggesting that Queen Camilla didn't understand or appreciate royal traditions the way Queen Elizabeth had. Caroline obtained Victoria's contact information and financial records. What she found was revealing. Victoria had recently made several large cash withdrawals from her savings account, totaling just over £50,000. The timing aligned with the payments made to Claire and Diane, with some left over for the creation of the replica gown and other expenses. Victoria also had a history of interest in historical textiles and had connections to costume makers and fabric specialists through her years of work. More damning was Victoria's digital footprint. The cyber forensics team had managed to trace some of the encrypted communications back to an internet cafe in a suburb of London. Security footage from that cafe showed Victoria on multiple dates that corresponded to when emails had been sent to Diane. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. Caroline felt confident she had identified the person behind the scheme, but she needed more to make an arrest that would hold up in court. She decided on a different approach. Rather than confront Victoria directly, Caroline worked with Sir Edmund to stage a controlled revelation. They would let it be known through carefully selected channels that the coronation gown had been found and that investigators were close to identifying who had placed it in Queen Camilla's wardrobe. They would suggest that the culprit was about to be exposed and that cooperation now might result in leniency. The bait was set through a conversation between Mrs. Whitmore and a former colleague of Victoria's, someone known to stay in touch with her. The colleague was told in confidence about the discovery and investigation. Mrs. Whitmore asked her to keep the information quiet, but knew from experience that such requests often had the opposite effect. People shared secrets, especially when they felt the information was important. Sure enough, within 24 hours, Victoria reached out to Diane Morrison. The phone call was brief, but it was made from Victoria's personal phone to Diane's number, establishing a direct connection between them for the first time. More importantly, Victoria's tone was urgent, almost panicked. She wanted to know if Diane had told the police anything, if there was any way the investigation could be traced back to her. Diane, who was cooperating with authorities, kept Victoria talking while the call was recorded. Victoria made several incriminating statements during that conversation. She expressed anger at the investigation moving so quickly, complained that the gown should have been discovered much later when attention had shifted elsewhere, and worried about whether the replica she had commissioned could be traced to her. It was enough to establish her involvement beyond reasonable doubt. Caroline obtained a warrant for Victoria's arrest. The arrest was carried out quietly at Victoria's home early one morning. She initially tried to deny everything, but when confronted with the evidence, including the recorded phone call, her defenses crumbled. She didn't break down crying or beg for forgiveness. Instead, she became coldly angry, her true feelings finally surfacing without restraint. Victoria explained her reasoning with a bitterness that was almost palpable. She felt that Queen Camilla had never earned her position, that she was an interloper who didn't understand or respect the traditions that people like Victoria had spent their lives preserving. The way Victoria saw it, Queen Elizabeth had represented everything that was right about the monarchy: dignity, duty, sacrifice. Queen Camilla, in Victoria's twisted view, represented the opposite: self-interest, convenience, a willingness to bend traditions to suit personal desires. The plan had been simple in Victoria's mind: plant the coronation gown in Queen Camilla's wardrobe, where it would eventually be discovered during a routine audit or cleaning. The press would have a field day with the story. Questions would be raised about how such a significant artifact had ended up in the Queen's personal collection. Suspicions would be cast on her character, her respect for royal heritage, perhaps even suggestions of theft or inappropriate acquisition. Even after the truth came out, the damage to her reputation would linger. People would remember the scandal, the headlines, the questions. Victoria had convinced herself that she was acting in defense of tradition and proper royal values. She saw herself as a guardian of Queen Elizabeth's legacy, punishing someone she viewed as unworthy. The fact that her actions constituted serious crimes didn't seem to register with her, or perhaps she simply didn't care. She had been willing to sacrifice Claire and Diane, to risk causing a constitutional crisis, all because of her personal grievances and distorted sense of justice. Caroline felt a deep sadness listening to Victoria's explanation. Here was a woman who had spent 2 decades in loyal service, whose knowledge and skills had contributed to countless royal ceremonies and occasions. But somewhere along the way, her dedication had curdled into obsession. Her pride had become arrogance, and her disappointment had festered into destructive bitterness. She had become exactly what she claimed to despise: someone who put personal feelings above duty and caused harm to the institution she claimed to love. The aftermath of the case was handled with the discretion and care that characterized the royal household's approach to sensitive matters. Victoria Ashford was charged with theft, conspiracy, and attempting to pervert the course of justice. Claire Davidson and Diane Morrison were also charged, though their cooperation with the investigation was taken into account. The trial was held with reporting restrictions in place to protect the integrity of the case and to minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation. Victoria was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in prison. Claire and Diane received suspended sentences and community service, their cooperation and the circumstances that had made them vulnerable to Victoria's manipulation considered as mitigating factors. All 3 were required to repay the money that had changed hands, though in Victoria's case much of it had already been spent. The coronation gown itself was returned to the Royal Collection Trust, where it underwent another round of careful examination to ensure it had suffered no damage during its unauthorized journey. Dr. Margaret Chen personally oversaw the process, and she was relieved to report that the gown remained in excellent condition. The conservation work was completed, and arrangements were made to display the gown as part of a special exhibition celebrating royal heritage and craftsmanship. For James Patterson, The guard whose sharp eyes and sense of duty had initiated the entire investigation, the resolution brought a quiet sense of satisfaction. He continued his regular patrols through Windsor Castle, walking the same corridors and checking the same rooms. But he carried with him the knowledge that his work mattered, that attention to small details and adherence to protocol could have significant consequences. Sir Edmund personally thanked James for his diligence, though the full story of his role in recovering the coronation gown would remain known only to a select few. Mrs. Whitmore implemented new security protocols in the wake of the incident. Additional cameras were installed in storage areas, and access logs were reviewed more frequently. The procedures for requesting information about items in the royal collection were tightened, requiring multiple levels of approval and more thorough documentation. She also initiated a program to better support staff members who might be experiencing personal difficulties, hoping to prevent future situations where loyal employees could be compromised by financial or emotional pressures. For Queen Camilla, the entire episode had been disturbing. Though she had been kept informed throughout the investigation, she understood that Victoria's actions had been motivated by personal bitterness rather than any legitimate grievance. But it was still painful to know that someone had harbored such intense animosity toward her. She met privately with Sarah Williams, the senior wardrobe mistress who had been devastated by the discovery that one of her team had been involved in the plot. During that meeting, Queen Camilla made it clear that she held no one on the current wardrobe staff responsible for what had happened. Claire had been manipulated by someone who understood how to exploit vulnerabilities, and the security failures that had allowed the plan to proceed were being addressed systematically. Sarah should focus on moving forward and continuing the excellent work she had always done. The Queen's grace in handling the situation earned her even greater respect from the household staff. In the weeks that followed, the story gradually receded from the forefront of everyone's minds. Life in the royal household returned to its normal rhythm of ceremonies, duties, and carefully maintained traditions. The coronation gown took its place in the exhibition, viewed by thousands of visitors who marveled at its beauty and historical significance, unaware of the drama it had recently been at the center of. Carolyn Hughes returned to London and to her other cases at Scotland Yard. The royal investigation had been one of the most complex and sensitive of her career, and she felt proud of how it had been resolved. She had prevented a potential scandal, recovered a national treasure, and brought those responsible to justice. More than that, she had ensured that an innocent person, Queen Camilla, hadn't been falsely implicated in a serious crime. That mattered to Caroline, who had dedicated her professional life to pursuing truth and justice. The media never got the full story. A brief statement was released indicating that 3 former royal household employees had been charged with theft of royal property and that all items had been recovered safely. The statement mentioned no details about what had been taken, where it had been found, or who had been targeted. Most news outlets carried the story as a minor item, speculating briefly about what might have been stolen before moving on to other topics. The royal family's reputation remained intact, and Queen Camilla was never publicly connected to the incident. For Victoria Ashford, sitting in her prison cell, there was time for reflection. The anger that had driven her actions began to fade, replaced gradually by a growing understanding of how badly she had miscalculated. She had thought she was defending tradition, but she had actually violated everything she claimed to value. The monarchy she had served didn't need her bitter protectiveness. It needed people who could adapt to change while honoring the past, who could serve with loyalty, but also with wisdom and compassion. The coronation gown she had tried to use as a weapon had survived kings and queens, wars and peace, triumph and tragedy. It represented continuity, yes, but also evolution. The same tradition that had produced that magnificent garment in 1953 was continuing in new forms, with new people, adapting to new times while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. Victoria's attempt to freeze that tradition in amber, to use it as a cudgel against change, had been doomed from the start. King Charles and Queen Camilla occasionally discussed the incident privately, usually late at night when the demands of public life had subsided and they could speak freely. They acknowledged that the path to acceptance and respect was sometimes difficult, that there would always be those who resisted change or harbored grievances. but they also took heart from how the situation had been handled, with professionalism, discretion, and a commitment to truth over politics. The royal household, that vast network of dedicated individuals who made the monarchy function, had proven its resilience. From James Patterson's initial vigilance to Mrs. Whitmore's steady management to Caroline Hughes's skilled investigation, the system had worked. It had protected the innocent, identified the guilty, and preserved the integrity of both the institution and the symbols it held dear. Years later, when historians would study the reign of King Charles III and Queen Camilla, this incident wouldn't merit more than a footnote if it was mentioned at all. But for those who had lived through it, who had worked to resolve it, it remained a reminder of several important truths. Traditions are only as strong as the people who guard them honestly and faithfully. The greatest threats to institutions often come from within, from those whose love has become possessive and destructive. And justice, when pursued with intelligence and compassion, can heal wounds rather than deepen them. The coronation gown continued to rest in its climate-controlled display case, its crimson fabric and golden embroidery still brilliant after more than 70 years. Visitors from around the world came to see it, to photograph it, to marvel at the skill of its creation and the history it represented. Children pressed their faces to the glass, imagining queens and ceremonies, while adults read the placard describing its significance and the day it had been worn. No one viewing the gown knew about its secret journey through the halls of Windsor Castle, or the conspiracy that had briefly threatened to make it a symbol of scandal rather than majesty. That was as it should be. The gown had a story to tell, but it was the right story now, the one that honored the past without being trapped by it, the one that celebrated tradition while acknowledging that traditions must live and breathe and adapt to survive. James Patterson sometimes paused during his patrols to think about that morning, when he had noticed an open door and decided to investigate. He wondered what would have happened if he had simply closed the door and moved on. The gown would have been discovered eventually, but perhaps too late to prevent the scandal Victoria had intended. Small choices mattered, he had learned. Diligence mattered. Doing one's duty without fanfare or expectation of reward mattered. These were old-fashioned values, perhaps. But then again, he worked in a castle that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. Old values had their place. The story ended not with grand drama, but with quiet restoration of order. The coronation gown was where it belonged. Those who had tried to misuse it had been held accountable. The royal family continued their work. The household staff continued their service. And in the great sweep of British history, this small episode would be remembered, if at all, as a moment when the system worked, when good people did their jobs well, and when the better angels of human nature prevailed over bitterness and malice. Sometimes that was the best happy ending anyone could hope for.